It's a real pleasure to be here with everybody. What I wanted to do is give you an update on some of our thinking and things that have changed since the pandemic. Disinformation, deception in technology continues to be, one of the most discussed and talked about issues of our time. Just today, I was listening to NPR. Two Iranians have recently been arrested and charged with espionage and other crimes for conducting disinformation campaigns in the US, in which they targeted Democrats after hacking a state's voter rolls, telling Democrats, pretending to be Proud Boys, that there was going to be violence at the polls, and then telling Republicans that mail-in votes were going to be edited. So it's a really recent, as in today, example of how concerned we are with the way that technology is changing, the way that deception takes place, and ultimately how we trust one another. And I've been doing a deep dive recently in this notion of trust in technology because of new forms of technology like crypto, Web 3.0, these other notions that think of new ways of trusting one another that don't require actually meeting one another, but relying on things like the blockchain, et cetera. And so this notion of what is happening to trust is really on my mind a lot. And we can go back throughout time and throughout history to see that trust is really the core for almost any society's success. Trust that dollar actually means something and will mean something tomorrow. Trust that you can reach out to friends and get help. Trust that what you're reading in the news is real and that you're seeing things that are actually credible. And when you add into that the ambiguity around what can we trust these days, along with the fear and ambiguity of a global pandemic, the notion of deception and trust has been just completely central to many of our lives. So what I thought I would do is I'll revisit some of the things I talked about in my last lecture, which was 2 years ago. And I'm sure all of you remember exactly what I said and all the main points. I'm kidding. My students at Stanford can't even remember what I told them in class on Tuesday. So I will give a more than in-depth summary. And if you don't remember what we talked about in 2019, don't worry, my feelings won't be too hurt. My core message last time was this, that when we want to think about how deception and trust work, we want to think about two things. One is the psychological aspects of whatever situation it is that we're interested in. We could take the Iranians, for example. Why would they engage in that kind of disinformation campaign in America? In that case, it was not to even persuade. It wasn't to make money. It was to foment polarization and dissent amongst Americans. So that was their sort of psychological goal. How did they do it? Well, 30, 20 years ago even, for an Iranian agent to get a message in front of me, Jeff Hancock, here in Palo Alto, California, would have cost insane amounts of money. Most likely the Iranian agent would have to get into the US. They'd have to find a way of meeting me, or at least getting my contact information. They'd have to reach out. They'd have to do a substantial amount of work. Now, with the advent of new technologies like social media, that would have been a trivial cost. They could say, okay, I want to target people in their 40s, male, white, a certain income class, and I'm going to target Northern California, and here's $1,000, and let's get this in front of 100,000 people. And so the technologies have changed in ways that allow people to accomplish their goals. This matters in lots of ways. So I can use technology to accomplish a goal like talking with all of you right now, which is really amazing. Allowed me to accomplish, interacting with, family and friends during the darkest times, March 2019, when we were literally sheltering in place. So there's many positive things that technology can allow us to do psychologically. But here's an example of where it can be used to accomplish negative goals, like trying to foment dissent. But it's very easy, I think, to really focus on the tech, the right-hand side of my screen, the fact that there's these computers and phones and new algorithms, AI, all these really new things that are really different from before. And because they're new, we give them a lot of attention. I think that makes a lot of sense. You know, they're new, we need to understand them. We need to kind of figure out, like, are these things going to be, you know, harmful, and in what ways? Are they beneficial in what ways? But the problem there is it always leads us to overestimate, in my view, the role of technology, and to underestimate the psychological aspects, what we know drives people to do things. And all of my research up until when I talked with you and met with you in 2019 suggested that there was one simple rule if you wanted to try and understand how some system or phenomena would take place. For instance, you know, is Sandy going to lie to me in this message or not? Did she lie to you in her introduction of me or not? Well, is it more important that we think about that it's on video conference and the features that it has, or is it the psychological aspect? And my studies to date suggest that psychology is much more important in understanding what is going to happen in terms of deception and trust than the technology. In almost every study I've done, psych trumps tech. Right? And that was one of the big main messages that we talked about last time. And just to refresh your memory about, like, the kinds of things that I was doing, and as a reminder, I'm a psychologist, so I tend to study how people interact with one another when technology is between them. So, for instance, I think of this, what we're doing now, as social media. I think of any technology that allows us to interact with one another as social media, rather than, well, social media is Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I think of it as a little bit of a bigger umbrella. And so, what's an example of how psychology trumps technology? Well, one of the concerns in the 2000s, when I first started doing research, was that people are probably lying more because we're interacting through text. And because we're interacting through text, you can't see my eyes, you can't see whether I look nervous, you can't hear the tone of my voice. And so since people can say all these things, then surely they're going to lie more often, right? And so this was a big concern. It remains a concern. People believe that people lie more often in text-based environments like texting, etc. And so we conducted a study back in 2004 that examined how often people lied face-to-face, on the phone, and in email, which were sort of like the dominant forms of communication then. And we did this with what's called a diary study. So we'd say, hey, Jeff, like, we want you to record all of your conversations that take place to face. And then we're going to get you to mark which ones of those contained a lie. And then we'll get you to do the same thing for any phone conversation. We'll get you to look at all your emails and do that. And what we found was this sort of pattern. Pretty much in every study we did, and we did several, but the first one was in 2004, we found that people lied the most on the phone, and they lied next most often face-to-face, and surprisingly, the least in email. Now, some of you are probably surprised to me, like, oh, that's really strange. I would have thought email was higher. And some others of you maybe remembering from my last talk, or you're sort of thinking it through, email actually has some really important properties that make lying a bad idea, actually. So the most obvious one, and I'm sure a number of you have thought of it, is that it creates a record, a really unusual and powerful record. It's a record that can be copied and shared infinitely. It's a record that you literally give to the person you're lying to. It's a record that has lots of different copies in sources that can be subpoenaed. So, for example, in New York State, when I was living there up until 2015, the number one form of evidence in divorce trial cases were email or text message, some electronic version. So all my lawyer friends don't call email electronic mail, they call it evidence mail. And so even though we think like, oh, okay, I'm going to lie more often in email because they can't see me and therefore I can lie more, that's not at all what happened. It turned out what mattered was things like, did it record me, right? I'm recording the lie. Whereas the phone had these other properties where It's usually not recorded. Sometimes it is, but default is it's not. We're not in the same room. So like right now, I could lie to you about where I am, that I'm not at my home. And I could lie to you about what I'm doing, but not really, because I'm talking to you and you can see that. But on the phone, I can tell you, yeah, no, I'm in the library, but in fact, I'm in the car on my way to Tahoe to go skiing or something like that. So the phone offered all these opportunities to lie and had fewer of the constraints. And what we did in this study was really try to emphasize that, yes, technology plays a role. It provides these sort of features and affordances, but it's not simply that the technology determines whether we lie or not. It's not because I can, talk to you without you seeing me or looking in my eyes. Rather that the technology provides opportunities and constraints on achieving my goals. Okay? So most of the time, we don't want to lie. Most people, most of the time, lying is the dispreferred way of achieving whatever goal it is you want. So it could be that Sarah, for example, I say to her, like, hey, what do you think of my new cardigan? She hates cardigan, thinks it looks terrible, but she doesn't want to make me feel bad right before talking to a couple hundred people, Stanford folks. So she said, oh, no, it's a nice haircut, right? So she didn't want to, her goal wasn't to lie to me. Her goal was to sort of be supportive. And one way to do that maybe would be to be deceptive. So she could have said also, no, I think you're thinking great, even though it doesn't. Okay, so we use deception as a way to achieving goals, and technology changes maybe some of the calculus on whether we do that or not. But what matters most is what our goal is, not what the technology is. Okay, so that's what we talked about. That's an example of the many studies I talked about when we met last. Since then, there's been a really cool replication of this work from this year, so 2021. And the question is, well, okay, that's 2004. Email is dominant. Instant messaging is coming online. Text messaging is getting pretty popular. But now we have social media. Now we have video conferences. Video conference is an everyday event now for most people, but wasn't at all in 2004. So what is going to happen? Is it the case that technology all of a sudden is going to take over and change everything, and that like social media is where we lie all the time? Well, in this study that just came out last week, a former student of mine, actually, who's now a professor at University of Oregon, went out and replicated this study from 20 years ago. It's very depressing, by the way. It's like, oh, in an important study 20 years ago, I was like, oh man, my studies are 20 years old now. Anyways, it's okay. I got over it. He replicated it. So really the same procedure, but like better methods, many more people. This is over 1,000 people, I believe, that he had doing this. But more importantly, he looked at like all of the tech that has emerged since 2004. Well, what did we see? Well, if we look at email, face-to-face, and phone, thankfully for me and my early study, we see the exact same pattern. Phone is where people continue to lie the most of those three, face-to-face next, and then finally email. Just one more thing about email, because it really surprises everybody every time. Email, as we're going to see, is a known network communication system. So with most email, most of the time you're interacting with people that you know. Sometimes I'm going to email people I don't, and sometimes people that I don't know are emailing me. But usually you have some kind of reputational tie. So it could be somebody's applying to work in my lab. Are they going to lie to me? Unlikely in that case, because if they do get accepted in the lab, then they could be discovered for that lie. And that's very different than, say, like, Cyberpunk 32476 on Twitter, who I have no idea who that is. We have no likelihood of interacting in the future and zero reputational tie. So emails are often between people that you know, family, friends, and most commonly now work. Okay, so that was really cool. That pattern replicated always makes the scientist feel good and not like an idiot. But what happens when we look at the newer technologies? Social media and texting look a lot like email for really very much the same ideas. Social media and texting also leave lots of records. And yes, we often think of social media as like, people narcissistically posting things that are nothing to do with their real life, but are these overly positive photos and showing just the best parts of their lives. That is true. We do have a positive bias when we're producing things in social media, but compared to what, right? So Are we that much more positive on social media than we are face to face? Here I am, I'm talking to you. I've got like a cardigan on, I wear a shirt. If I look at the audience, for those of you that have cameras on, you're all wearing clothes too, right? You're all looking nice. So face to face, when we're interacting face to face, we also present positively, right? And so social media does allow us to do things like take 100 photos at an event and then just choose the one where we look the best. But when we get up in the morning, most people will also try to look, the best, put their best foot forward. So in fact, this idea of positive self-presentation isn't necessarily deceptive. We can look, for example, at men's shoes. This is a technology, yes. And when we look at the average height of men's shoes, it's about 1 inch. Why? Well, men are aware that other people think that taller men are more attractive. So they're using this very old technology, shoes, to accomplish the goal of appearing attractive. In much the same way that people use social media and the affordances it has there, the ability to say, filter some things, edit, write that really funny line, but think about it for an hour before posting it. Same idea. It's similar to the men's heel on their shoe. They're using it to accomplish the goal of coming across either funny, attractive, competent, etc. So that's why we see that. Now, this is different. And when we look at social media, this is their own social media production when communicating either with other people they know or with people that they're linked to. This is not advertising, right? This is not sort of people buying the ability to get a message in front of my face, in front of my attention. That's different. We'll talk about that in a bit. This is actual people's production of messages and posts in social media. Texting, the same thing. We're interacting with people we know, that we have reputational ties with. Just because I'm texting my wife, right, doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to lie more. Why would that happen? I don't want to lie to my wife. I mean, there's going to be times when I definitely will lie to my wife. Like if I'm running late and I told her I'd be there on time for sure, yeah, probably I'll invoke some California traffic to make myself not look so bad. But just because I'm using text doesn't mean like, aha, my wife can't see me, therefore I'm going to lie more often. Instead, because we're just using those goals, we're trying to accomplish our goals, and we're using text to accomplish them. So that's really been fascinating. Here we see, though, that video chat, like Zoom, like we're on right now, has the same lie rate as the phone. And it's because it has similar, features. There's typically no record, unlike today, but most Zoom calls don't leave a record. Other similar reasons for why do we see more lying on the phone? Most of the time, we only lie as like a last resort. One reason we have to lie is because we get asked a question and you have to respond pretty quickly. If I were to pause for more than about a second right now, it would get really weird really fast. You might start thinking like, oh, is Jeff having like a seizure or a heart attack or something like that? So we have a lot of pressure to speak quickly. And so sometimes, like, again, if I'd said, hey, Sarah, what do you think? How do I look? She doesn't have very much time to come up with a response. So if she says, oh, no, I like it, even though she doesn't, then okay, now there's a lie that's happened. And part of that is because of the synchronicity of media like the phone and the video chat. So all this is to say that I continue to believe that psychology is more important than technology when trying to understand things like deception and trust. But it's not that technology plays no role. It interacts and provides some opportunities and constraints for us to achieve whatever interpersonal goal we might have. And that might make deception more or less more common. But let's take a look at the overall patterns there. The most deceptive media were phone and video chat, and it was at 12%, right? So most of the time, most people are telling the truth. And that is the default. We see that most of the time in almost all the studies on deception detection. In fact, if we look at the last 70 years of deception detection research, there's only one effect that replicates every single time. And that effect is something called the truth bias. When you ask people to decide whether somebody or some message is a lie or not, people are much more likely to say it's true. So we have this thing that is now a theory called the truth default. So truth default theory says our basic response to any other human message is to trust it, right? So our default is to say, yep, that's truthful. And that's actually the only finding that replicates in almost every deception detection study. And there's hundreds of them now, hundreds. And it's kind of a cool finding. It really means that like we're at heart, a trusting species. Philosophers and cognitive scientists have argued that this is really important for humanity, that it's allowed us to evolve language as we use it. That is, that we believe that our communication partners are cooperative and truthful partners. It's probably what allows us to have language. It's allowed us to build society. This truth bias in some ways could be the very core of what has led humans to be as successful as they are. Other things that we've learned from all of that work is that we're actually not really that good at detecting deception. So if I were to show you two messages and I would say, okay, what do you think? Which one is deceptive? Which one's truthful? And you had no other information and you couldn't ask any questions, all you could do is look at the two messages. You'd perform at chance. So hundreds of studies, the average is 54%. There's two reasons for that. One is that truth bias. I'm always going to say true, 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 true. So if in a study that you went into in my lab and I presented you with, say, 5 pieces of fake news and 5 pieces of real news, you'd say true, true, true all the time, right? That's the expectation. And so you do really well on the truthful ones. You might get 5 out of 5 on true messages, but you do really bad on the deceptive messages. And so when you average those two things out, it comes to chance, right? You get 5 of the truth, right? So you're 5 out of 5 on that, great. But you're 0 to 5 on deception. And that leads us to be sort of like 50-50. There's one other reason, and that is that there is actually no Pinocchio's nose. This is really hard to sort of like, what's the right word, to really believe. I think we humans have a fundamental belief that we can tell when other people are lying. It's probably what thing that allows us to trust everybody so much is like, oh no, I can tell when people are lying. And I really know, like they look away or their eyes look up and to the left. But no matter what any other book or TED Talk telling you how people lie will tell you, I can guarantee you that after looking at hundreds of studies with tens of thousands of participants, there is no Pinocchio's nose. And although that's hard to really believe, and it took me a long time to believe that, even as somebody studying it, there is no one cue that will always tell you. I do think there are cues that are given off in different contexts, and in the question period, we can talk about it if people are interested. 2 more things that we've learned is that people don't lie for no reason. Most people lie for a reason. They're trying to accomplish something and it's the best option. So for those 2 Iranians that were arrested recently, they were trying to create dissent in America, and deception was one option that they had to do it. And so that's what they went with. But we see this not only like in disinformation, but also in how we interact day to day. Most of the time, most of us are quite honest. That said, there are some individuals that sometimes are really deceptive. So when we've done all these studies looking at how many times you lie in your text messaging, how many times you report lying in a day, most people lie very little. But there's a few people that account for almost all the lies that are told. And we call these folks prolific liars. The Iranians may not be prolific liars in their day-to-day lives with their families, etc., but their job was getting them to become these sort of prolific liars. And when we look at everything on social media and the production of disinformation, we see a similar pattern, that most disinformation is produced by a small number of people. And as we'll see at the end of the talk today, most sharing of misinformation is done by a small number of people. And we'll talk about who those folks are in a bit. Okay, so that's a little bit of a primer of what we've learned about deception based off of 70 years of work. And it's important. And I've highlighted this truth bias thing because I think it's actually really fundamental for this notion of trust that we started at the beginning. And I'm going to share with you some concerns I have about how we're undermining the truth bias and trust. Okay. To get to that, let me just reiterate this thing about how the truth bias works in deception studies. because it's a bit weird. So imagine you come to the social media lab at Stanford and we put you into a study. And in that study, we're going to either get you to interact with somebody that's maybe lying or maybe telling the truth. We might show you some fake or real news. We might show you a deceptive hotel review or a real hotel review. And your job is to decide, is it truthful or not? And what will happen is, because you have a truth bias, we all do, we say true, 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 true. And maybe every once in a while we'll be like, fake. I'll throw fake in there because I know it's an experiment and Professor Hancock's always got some lying going on in there. So I say true, true, true most of the time. Now, what that means is when it comes to detection accuracy, which is on the y-axis here, that means I'm going to do really well on truthful messages. Okay, so I'm going to perform at 90%, let's say. But for all those deceptive messages, I'm going to do really poorly, right? So let's say that I showed 10 messages, 5 are truthful, 5 are fake. The 10 I do really well, and the fake I do really bad because I'm saying true, true, true. So I'm getting kind of like duped, right? Now, why on earth would this be a good way to be a human? Right? Like, how could this allow our communication system to work? It's because most of the time, most of the people we're talking to are being truthful to us. When we look at text messaging studies, when we look at diary studies, etc., well over 90% of the messages that people produce and the conversations that they have are truthful. They contain no deception. So when Sandy and Sarah and I were meeting earlier today, we had a half-hour conversation. There was probably, I can't tell for sure with Sandy and Sarah, but no deception. And so the idea of true, true, true all the time means that it's really efficient. It's that, okay, I'm going to assume that you're telling the truth most of the time. I'm going to take what you say as face value. And it leads to very efficient communication. Of course, we're vulnerable then, right, to deception. And in fact, there is deception in communication systems, in human communication systems. And as long as that deception doesn't get so high that my truth bias is no longer efficient, then having a truth bias makes tons of sense, because most of the time I'm being told the truth. Now, what happens when I don't have a truth bias? Oh, sorry. And that leads to this thing called discriminant trust. That is, you want to trust, the information and the people that are being honest with you, and you want to not trust the people that aren't. So I'm actually doing pretty well here. I'm saying true, true, true all the time. And because I'm being told the truth most of the time, it works out really well for me. It means I'm actually pretty accurate. Okay, because most of the time I'm being told the truth and I'm saying true all the time. Now, what happens if there's no truth bias? So some of the times I say true, some of the times I say fake. We're really bad at detecting and discriminating what's fake and what's real for messages. So there I'm just going to be randomly saying true, randomly saying false. And what happens is I get sort of 50% for lies and 50% for truths. Now, if you compare those two graphs, you can see good news. I am not getting deceived as much, right? Now, instead of being deceived successfully 90% of the time, I was only 10% accurate. Now I'm up to 50%. That's like a 5 times improvement in my deception detection, right? That I'm now not getting duped as much. But if we look at the other bar of truths, I'm actually disbelieving real information half the time. Okay, so my improvement on the lying fake side, which is substantial, comes at a cost. I don't trust real information as much, and therefore I'm wrong a lot. Now you can probably anticipate where I'm going here. Right? When we were doing projects around vaccine hesitancy or all the crazy amounts of COVID-19 misinformation, there's a lot of real information that's credible and genuine and good around the vaccine, for example. But if I no longer have a truth bias, then I'm not going to believe that information. And now it's no longer intellectually interesting for Professor Hancock, but it could lead to death, right? It's a public health risk now. So this is a big deal, I think. Do we have a truth bias or do we not? All right, now let me pause there. It's been a lot so far. And I'll just tell you that this might be a dangerous amount of graphs for this time of evening. So I just want to say, if you're doing well so far, then kudos, and you deserve a glass of wine. I'm going to have a little sip here myself. It is after 6 after all. So hopefully everybody's with me. I'm going to have a few more graphs for you. But last time I did this, you all ate it up anyways. All right, so what does this mean then with this truth bias or a lack of truth bias in our real world media consumption? Up until now, I've been telling you about the area that I work in the most, which is interpersonal interaction, how we talk with people that we know, our family, our friends, online dates, that we want to know better, our employees, our colleagues, all those things where we kind of have reputational ties. That's where my work lies. But what about news? Okay, so is all those principles that I just talked about in terms of truth bias and the effect it can have on true versus, say, fake news, do we see the same sort of things? So until very recently, most studies that looked at how people came to trust news or not, this is 80s through 90s, showed the exact same truth bias, that people were pretty much always believing things that came in the news. Unfortunately, we've seen a pretty big decline in a truth bias around news. So this is a study that my former PhD student did. And what we found was this. Now, there's a lot of data. Don't worry too much. Basically, what we did is exactly what I sort of set up before. We showed people 10 news items that actually appeared in social media around the 2016 election. 5 of them were real news, and 5 of them were fake. So they had 10 that they had to make decisions on. And they were, some that were looking at health topics, some were looking at politics, and some were looking at science. So those are the different types. And we have detection accuracy on the vertical axis there. And black is these were real, or sorry, black was, these were fake news. And the gray were real news. And what you can see there is not the sort of truth bias typical thing where you would see that veracity effect that you do really well on truthful things. Instead, we see the no truth bias. They were basically performing equivalently on fake and real news. Now, I should pause for a second because fake news gets tossed around a lot. A lot of scientists have sort of worried about that term because it's a little bit vague, and lots of news is gradient. Some has some truth, but it's wrapped in fake or whatever. And that's completely true. In question time, I'm really willing to talk more about that. But really, what I'm talking about here is information that's problematic and has been intentionally sort of served to look like real news, but is in fact not genuine news. And the depressing thing here was we were finding that our truth bias for news goes away. So good news, they were doing pretty well at detecting the fake news. They were, approaching 60% for health. They were over 60% accuracy, almost 70% for politics. That's good. That means that they're not getting duped as much. But it comes at this huge cost. They were being presented with real news, and they were distrusting it almost half of the time. So that's a big problem. But it's only a problem, right, if we're seeing way more fake news or a lot of fake news compared to the amount of real news. So if we're living in a media ecosystem in which there's a lot of fake news, then this is maybe good because we're now suspicious most of the time. We're not going to say true. And that's going to lead me to be duped less often. But if we're in a media ecosystem in which there's actually quite low amounts of fake news and most of it's real, then it's a big problem because now I'm not going to trust things that are real. So that's the question we're going to work on next. And here I'm just summarizing what I was saying, that we're enhancing our ability to detect fake news. So that's good because we're just more suspicious most of the time. We don't have that truth bias, that trust default, but we're undermining our ability to believe real news. And that's bad, right? So there's a gain, but there's a cost. All right, so this is some brand new work. I was just telling Sarah and Sandy that you are the first audience to ever hear this work. We've just got it together and we're about to send it to Nature. It's a replication of a study that examined how many people in the US were exposed to untrustworthy websites. So what they did in this 2016 analysis is they installed a special bit of software on a large sample of people, 1,200 that are representative sample of Americans, and they watched every URL that they went to for 4 weeks before the election and 1 week after. So they followed 1,200 people. They have 7 or 8 million URLs that they've tracked, and there's databases that can say, okay, here's URLs that are what we would call untrustworthy websites. So these are sites that repeatedly publish fake news, completely false information. Okay, and 44% of Americans is a lot of Americans getting exposed to these sites. It was, sort of a shocking number, even though that fake news was kind of like a new topic and phenomenon then. And so what we did is we replicated the exact same procedure in 2020, 4 weeks before the 2020 election, 1 week afterwards. And what we wanted to know was what's the difference now? Are we seeing more people getting exposed, fewer people getting exposed, or is it somewhere in the same? And there's lots of reasons to think both ways, and you're probably starting to think of reasons why it might go one way or the other. And that's good, because Sarah's about to launch a poll, and your job is to decide, do you think that there is more fake news? Sorry, is there more exposure to these untrustworthy websites in 2020 compared to 2016? So the poll's been launched. Go ahead and put in your answer. As you're doing that, I'll give you some reasons to think one way and the other. Well, 2020 was a pretty contested election. We also have COVID happening. There were a lot of concerns about disinformation. So in 2016, it wasn't really a concern yet. Now there's a ton of concerns. Also, everybody knows what it is. So now people know how to do that. So perhaps there's just a lot more people engaging in this. On the other hand, when a society starts to pay attention to a problem, we kind of solve the problem in a way, right? Like we work on it, we are aware of it. Now I know that there's things like disinformation. I know there's these fake websites, so I'm maybe less likely to get duped. Perhaps the platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Google have gotten better at preventing people from, getting referred to those. Maybe there's factors that are sort of balancing out this idea of like, now that we're getting flooded with disinformation, but we're maybe better at not going to it. So those are some of the thoughts that we had as we went and did this. Again, this is like literally, we just finished these analyses. We just shared this with a small group of colleagues to get feedback on, but you're the first public group to learn about the study. I'm really excited to share with you, and let's see what people have to say. So this is fascinating. In fact, I want to include this in our paper. Compared to the 2016 election, during the 2020 election, this group believes, 74% believe that there's more people exposed to untrustworthy websites. Yeah, and I'm just going to tell you that was sort of my sense as well. 10% believe that fewer people were exposed to untrustworthy websites. And 15%, these are the reasonable, thoughtful people, same amount of people were exposed to untrustworthy websites. Now, the problem with you saying thoughtful people is you have to understand with science, if it's the same, it's not going to get published. I'm sorry. So that answer is wrong. I wouldn't be telling you about it if it was, no, hopefully I would tell you if it was the same, but we tend to have our publishing setup is that you need to see differences. So, right. So A or B is correct. It turns out that it's fewer people. We actually find that there's that 25% of Americans in our representative sample of about 1,200, so a pretty large sample. So that was shocking, and we were suspicious. So we did a whole bunch of other analyses I'm going to share with you really briefly. So we're like, well, maybe there's fewer people, but the people that do go are going to weigh more of them. No, turns out that we didn't really see that compared to 2016. If you did get exposed, people got exposed to fewer on average. Maybe they're spending way more time on them. No, turns out that if you did hit a website that was untrustworthy in 2016, you would be there for a little over a minute. And now in ours, it was about 47 seconds. So it looks like people are getting away from it faster. In every measure that we looked at, people were going to these untrustworthy sites less. And I didn't even tell you this, I didn't want to bias you, but we had a way bigger microscope. So in 2016, they had about 500 sites that were this sort of quality that was repeatedly publishing this stuff, and that people were sort of like bumping into. And we had 1,500 of these sites that like dominate the disinformation industry. So even with our much larger microscope, we were seeing less. So that's like really good news in some ways, right? But it's also bad news. So 25% of adult Americans is a lot of Americans, right? We're talking close to 60 million. And when we extrapolate out to like, okay, well, if we took the average of our 1,200 that got exposed and we multiplied that times 60 million, it's over 1 billion exposures to untrustworthy websites. That is non-trivial, right? That is a lot of exposures. Then again, there are dozens of billions of website visits by Americans in a day. Right? So that billion was over a 5-week period. And we're talking like, I don't even know how many billions now, it's 20 to 30 visits in a day. So you're comparing like 1 billion compared to trillions of visits that would have happened over that time. So it's a small percentage. And that's going to matter, right? Because given our truth bias, if it's a small amount compared to the amount we're actually seeing, then us losing our trust in news and information is going to be really bad, because it means that we're not trusting information we see on the internet, which would generally be true, even though we're getting better at detecting that fake stuff. So that's the next question is, okay, well, what's most people's media diets? At the risk of sending you home in shock because of so much data, I want to share with you what I think is one of the best studies looking at people's overall media diet. And it's by a colleague of mine, Duncan Watts, and his group, who were at Microsoft at the time. And they have this data. It looks a little bit funky. I'm going to not tell you to not worry too much. But what they did is they worked with some really big companies to get their entire media experience, both mobile and on TV and on desktop. Because one thing is that we don't talk about TV very much, right? We don't talk about, say, MSNBC and Fox News. We focus a lot on social media. But this study doesn't. It includes all of it. Now, two really big important things to see here. On the bottom is people that are over 55, and on the top are people that are younger than 55. The green, the dark green, is news, right? Any green is news. So most people that are over 55, they're consuming news, but it's only about 15% of their media diet. Look at the people under 55. There's not much news consumption there. What are people doing with media? Well, they're being entertained. It's sports, it's shopping, it's non-news. So that's an important first part, is like, let's just also remember that with most of the time, we're not trying to get news. The second thing to look at, and you might have to squint, is the red lines for the top and bottom, which is at the very top of both graphs. That's the percentage of their media diet that was fake news. Okay, you almost have to squint to see it. Compared to everything that they're seeing tiny amounts of fake news. In fact, the number is 14% is what on average people's news consumption is of their total diet. Of their total diet, 0.15% of the media that they consume is fake news. I mean, it's shocking. That is a tiny amount. Now, let's say that they're wrong by like 10-fold, 100-fold. That's still only 1 or 2% of their media consumption. So what does that mean for us then, right? If we go back to this truth bias idea, by us freaking out everybody about disinformation, that you can't trust anything online, that you can't trust the news anymore, what we're doing is we're gaining our ability to be accurate on a minuscule part of our media diet. So again, that's good that we're improving our ability to detect that stuff because we're suspicious, but we're undermining our trust in real information. And that makes up the vast majority of our media. If we were a military right now, then we would basically be disbelieving everything that we're encountering. And when I talk to people that work in Department of Defense sort of spaces, understanding and believing real information is kind of the key to any kind of adversarial combat. And if we were, to think of the metaphor of war, we'd be losing right now because we really don't believe things that are real. And I think this is one of the big problems that the issue of disinformation has in our public conversation right now, is that it's worrying everyone that everything they see is likely to not be real, that there's so much misinformation out there. Now, here's the problem. And again, this is a struggle for me. This is new to me because I'm a psychologist. I tend to work on like how people interact with other people on technology, is having to think about this idea that like disinformation is clearly a real problem. Again, I'll go back to the Iranians arrested today. They're engaging in a disinformation campaign. I work with the Stanford Internet Observatory. I work with my colleagues at the University of Washington, and we're detecting these disinformation campaigns all the time. They're real. Disinformation is a real issue. The problem is that it's not a major issue for most people most of the time. So what do I mean by that? What's an example? Well, here's a question. We won't do a poll because I want to make sure we save time for questions. Who shares the most misinformation? Who actually gets exposed and then shares misinformation? Turns out that it's people older than 65. Okay. So people 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 45, 50, if I were to get you to look at whatever feed you want, Facebook, Instagram, maybe your Gmail inbox, and I'll get you to spend a whole bunch of time looking through it, you would find probably no fake news. Probably none. If you're older than 50, 65, you would probably find some. It's not that older people are dumb or anything like that, it's that they're being targeted. Why are they being targeted? Again, it goes back to those sort of psychological principles. If you're a disinformation agent, or you have a couple goals. One is persuasion. Well, who's the most civically engaged group? Who's the most civically engaged demographic? By far, it's people over 65. They're the ones that are going to vote. They're the ones that are going to volunteer, right? They're engaged in their communities. Those are the people that you want to go after. What if you want to make money? Well, the wealthiest demographic by far is people over 65. So you're going to send out disinformation to them about COVID, about the election, about whatever you want, because that is going to be your target. You're trying to make money. So we're working now to try and think like, how do we calibrate the message so it's not like, hey, everybody trust nothing, which to me is going to undermine society. And instead say, hey, older folks, you're being targeted. You need some resources and help. Let's get that to you. One example of, I'm just going to skip through all this stuff about why older folks may struggle with that is, perhaps we can give them things like media interventions, digital literacy. So here's an example of a course. You can all take this. I can share the information with the organizers. It takes 1 hour. You learn 6 things like lateral browsing, where you see something that you're skeptical of, you're curious of, and you open up another browser and use Google search or whatever other search engine that you use and trust, and research it. These are things that younger generations do sort of naturally, but people that are 65 and older, many of them didn't know like that's something that you could do. And it leads to really, really big improvements really fast. And we're doing studies now to see how durable that is. But I think in addition to saying, hey, we need to really, work over the platforms, we need new laws, we need enforcement, we need penalties. If Facebook continues to spread disinformation, they need to be penalized. In addition to all that, we need as people to become more resilient. We need to train our society to be more civically responsible. We are the ones ultimately that have to stop the sharing of the misinformation. And so I'm really excited about this kind of work. I'm not trying to have this talk be like, oh my God, we're destroying society by undermining our trust. Instead, I actually see solutions, because it's not that everybody is seeing fake information all the time. So I think in the end, what we have to do is hold 2 truths in our brains at the same time. I'm seeing, are the truths there? Yeah. Okay. So the 2 truths are fewer people than we think are actually getting exposed, and they're getting exposed to less misinformation than we think. That's true, I think. At the same time, for those that are exposed, right, they get exposed to COVID misinformation, they get exposed to political misinformation. It has terrible consequences. The January 6th insurrection being a prime example. We're looking at QAnon folks whose families just get torn apart. People that don't believe that the vaccines work and are more likely to die, right? This is really important, but both of them are true. And how do we talk about it in society without freaking everyone out so that we just stop trusting real things? And I think that both of these are going to play a role in how we trust one another. And ultimately, I think we succeed if we can overcome this current moment of distrusting everything and getting better at trusting what we should and distrusting what we shouldn't without panicking about it all. Thanks so much for your attention. Thank you also to my colleagues who are listed here, who do a vast majority of the work, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks again for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That I'll hold on to the positive that there's less disinformation out there than I might have thought, although I apparently am one who is being targeted with it. I'll try to pull up questions and relay them to you, but feel free to jump in if you can see some you want to focus on.
Yeah, one of them is a really good point about, I think this is coming from Burned. Not all lies are the same, 100%. And the example he gives is former President Trump. And I hesitate to use President Trump in some ways because I don't want this to become political. I don't think that, say, liberals or conservatives have a monopoly on, being good at trusting or decepting detectors. It is true that I think when we look at President Trump compared to the previous, say, 6 to 8 presidents, he uses lies in ways that are much different than everybody else, much higher rates and much more, big, right? And so the election being a fraud is perhaps one of the most problematic ones. So yes, one of the things I think is weird about this study for me when we got that finding was like, we've all been exposed to misinformation and that the election was fraudulent. And that's clearly, there's no evidence to support that. And apologies, again, I don't want this to be conservative liberal because I just think that it's too tied up in that. So yes, all presidents have used lies and they have been small and big, but President Trump is quite different than other presidents. But we've documented lies by Democratic presidents and by Republican presidents. So I think that is a big one, and I think it's important to remember that. And again, for the big, the 2020 election being a fraud, that actually wasn't primarily done via social media. It was done on, the news, right? And all of the major, news organizations had to cover it. There's a president saying things, and we as responsible citizens should listen to that. That's part of the problem there. I think that TV news is a big issue that tends to be under examined. Let's see. I'm going to try and pick something that's not too conservative liberal question. This survey, who is the judge of what is fake? Yeah, really good question. So in our studies, we rely on a consortium of fact checkers. And one concern we always have is that perhaps they're biased. And so that's why we tend to rely on a number of different fact checkers that have, again, like I hate that everything comes down to conservative liberal. Like our lives are so much richer and differentiated than that. But we try to make sure we have both fact checkers that are coming from those kinds of news organizations, but also what we call congruence. So we also include disinformation, misinformation topics that say a Democrat would be more likely to believe or more consistent with Democrat beliefs, and Republican ones that are more congruent with Republican beliefs, to try and make sure we balance that out. Yeah, so this question often comes around filter bubbles and things like that. It is related to the truth bias. So when we start to distrust general information, we go to places that we feel familiar and we trust things that seem like they're consistent with our beliefs rather than trying to understand sources and things like that. So I do think it is related to these issues that are really big and really important. And so my final conclusion is, we have some of the most powerful technology we've ever created in search engines. I think that Google does a very good job of surfacing authoritative content. It's not perfect, but it's really good. So when you encounter something that you're suspicious of, Google it, or use whatever local news or national organization that you think is best, and check with that. And it really, just by slowing down and thinking about accuracy, we will stop the spread of fake news and disinformation by not being the ones that continue to share it. And that's what disinformation operations depend on, is that we will share the information. Once we, the people, stop sharing it, it's over. So with that, I think there is optimism, and I'm excited for the future. And again, thank you so much for your attention and spending time with me in the evening.